Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today I'm uploading two videos. The first one, this one, is how I made this little number, so how I sewed it up. And the second one, which I shall link down below, is how I patterned it. So if you're interested in seeing how I sewed it up, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, I'm using this silk fabric, which is super lightweight and perfect for a little top like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my back bodice. I have two layers of that fabric underneath my pattern piece. A little notch at the back neck and onto the front. My fabric underneath is on the fold. A notch at the centre of the neck and at the bottom of my dart. And now to mark that dart. So I'm just popping a pin in at the point and then putting a little chalk mark just where the pin pierces the fabric, and then drawing a line from that chalk mark down to the notches you see me snip. And now to pin. So I'm just popping the pin in through the top of the fabric, making sure when it comes out the bottom it's directly on that line you see me mark. A pin on the horizontal at the point of the dart, and that's that done. Same on the other side, ready for stitching. So starting at the bottom of the dart, back stitching, following that chalk line the whole way up and just pulling my threads at the end. I'll tie them off. So I've done both of my darts here, given my fabric a little bit of a press and onto the back. So I'm laying one back piece over the other, right sides together, and I'm going to pin from that notch right the whole way down. Stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way down. Back stitching at the start and the end. So that's my centre back sewn up with a little slit at the top. And now to finish this seam, I'm just going to do clean seams here. So I'm going to press the seam open first of all, and then I'm going to fold my raw edges in underneath. A lot of you will have already seen this many times, but for those of you that haven't, I'm just pinning the fabric onto my sleeve roll. It just makes it much easier for me to get a nice crease. And then I'm going to fold those raw edges in underneath, just so that everything is nice and clean. Pop the pin in to hold the fabric in place. Give it a little bit of a press, and I'm going to do that down both sides. So that's me all pressed and ready for stitching. So I'm stitching right along that crease edge the whole way down using a little bit of a longer stitch length. Back stitching at the start and the end. So that's that done, and I'll do the same on the other side. And that's how it looks from the outside, so it gives a nice bit of interest from the outside, and from the inside everything is nice and clean. So now I'm ready to sew up my shoulder seams. So I'm placing my front over my back, wrong sides together, and pinning. And stitching here at about half of my seam allowance. I'm sewing French seams, so I'm going to sew this seam twice. So the first one, wrong sides together at half of my seam allowance, trimming off the excess seam allowance, pressing that seam nice and flat, folding my fabric right sides together this time, little bit of a press, pinning in place, and ready to sew the second line. So again, stitching at about half of my seam allowance, so about 5 millimeters from the edge, back stitching at the start and the end, and that is my shoulders, nicely French seamed. So I've just given them a little bit of a press, And now for the side seams. And I'm going to sew these seams in exactly the same way as I did the shoulder. So I'm pinning them first of all, wrong sides together, stitching at half of my seam allowance, back stitching at the start, trying to stay at half of my seam allowance the whole way up. I'm going to trim off the excess seam allowance, press, put my fabric right sides together, press again and pin, and here stitching again at about half of my seam allowance. And that's how that looks. Nice and clean, nice and neat. So that's both my side seams done. And now I'm ready to tackle the hem. So I've just pressed the hem up by about half of my seam allowance. And now I'm running a stitch line as close to that crease line as I can. I'm doing a narrow rolled hem here. So I want to make sure my stitches are very close to that crease edge. So that's how that looks. And now I've just got to trim off that excess seam allowance. And I'm going to do that the whole way around. So I'm snipping so that I'm quite close to that stitch line. And now to sew for the second time. So I'm folding up the fabric by about half of my seam allowance, and I'm going to stitch from the inside right on that crease edge. So this will give me one line of stitching on the outside and 2 lines of stitching on the inside, and my hem will be quite narrow. It's just a nice neat finish that I like. So trying to stick to that crease line the whole way along, back stitching at the start and the end, and from the inside and from the out, nice and neat. So I've given it a little bit of a press, so that's my hem all done. So now I want to finish the armholes, and I've decided to do that with a bias finish. So I've cut myself a little bit of bias tape from the outer fabric. I folded in one edge of that bias tape to make it nice and clean, given it a press, and pinning here to the underarm, and ready to stitch. Back stitching at the start, and I'm sewing right on the edge of that bias at my seam allowance, so I'm about 1 centimetre in from the edge of the armhole itself. I'm just snipping off the excess bias, popping that cut edge inside the folded edge you've seen me show at the start, and that's how that looks. And here, just snipping off that excess seam allowance. So I've just completed that trimming off camera. I've pressed the bias away from the bodice and made sure the seam allowance underneath is facing the bias. And I'm going to understitch here. So if you watched my last video, I tried this out on the last dress I made and I really liked the finish and thought I would use it again here. So just stitching about 1 millimetre or 2 away from that seam edge. That's just going to make everything lie super flat and super neat. And now I've pressed the bias tape this time towards the bodice on the inside. And I'm just running a stitch line right along that crease edge of the bias, the whole way around the armhole. Back stitching at the start and the end. And from the inside, that's how it looks. And the outside, just 1 line of stitching, nice and neat. So that's both of my armholes done. My shoulder seams all nicely French seamed. I've got that lovely bit of interest along the centre back. My centre back neck nicely finished, and my hem all finished. My darts all in place, and now I'm ready to tackle my flounces. So for cutting out, I have my front flounce side 1, my front flounce side 2, and my back flounce. So I have 4 layers of fabric underneath my back flounce and 2 layers underneath both of my front pattern pieces. A little notch at the center front on both of those. So now I want to join my flounces together at the shoulder seams. So on the left hand side I have my front piece side 1, on the right hand side my front piece side 2, and here I'm laying my back pieces over the top of each, right sides together, and pinning along those shoulder seams. And I'm doing this twice for all pieces. So I'm just going to stitch those shoulder seams at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And of course I'm doing this for all 4 pieces, I'm just showing 2 here. So that's my front side 1 and my front side 2 joined at the shoulder to the back pieces. And that's how they look when they've been given a nice press. And now I need to join those pieces together around the outside circle. So I've just laid one on top of the other, right sides together, and pinned right along that outer edge. And ready to stitch. So back stitching at the start, at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, taking it nice and easy around that beautiful curve, trying to stick to my 1 centimeter the whole way around. A little pivot at my corner. And back stitching at the end. And of course I do exactly the same to my other side. And now I'm ready to trim off the excess seam allowance. So I'm using my pinking shears here because this will help me out in 2 ways. Number 1, it will trim that excess fabric away. And number 2, the little triangle indents will reduce the bulk of that seam allowance, so it'll allow me to get a nice smooth curve when I turn everything right side out. Off camera I'm going to give them a really good press, and once done this is how they look. So now they're ready to go on to the bodice. So I want the flounce, this one that has that little bit of a longer extension, to lie underneath the other flounce. So I'm going to pin that first of all. So I have a notch at the center front of my bodice and a notch at the center of the flounce. I'm lining those up, then my shoulder seam, and then my center back. And once that's done, I'll distribute a few more pins off camera, and then the same for the other side. So lining up the center at the front, lining up the shoulder seam, and the center back, popping in a few more pins just to make sure it's nice and secure and everything's lined up and ready to stitch. Stitching here just within my 1 centimeter seam allowance, trying to maintain that nice curved shape the whole way around, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's both of my flounces nicely attached. And now I'm ready to finish off the neckline, and I'm going to do that using a bias finish here as well. So back stitching at the start, sewing right along the edge of that bias tape at my 1 centimeter seam allowance this time. That will make sure that that line of stitches you just seen me sew is nicely hidden within the seam allowance. And then once I get to the end, just trimming off the excess bias, folding that cut edge in underneath, lining it up with the edge of my bodice, and back stitching at the end. And I'm going to finish this bias tape in exactly the same way as I did the armholes. So I've pressed the bias away from the bodice, made sure my seam allowance is facing the bias, and I'm stitching right along the edge of that seam, just about 1 millimeter or 2 away, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. I'm just folding that bias towards the bodice, and I'm going to stitch right along that crease edge, and I've made sure that I've pulled my flounce out towards the right so I'm not stitching through it at all. That will mean that this stitch line that I'm sewing now is going to be hidden in underneath the flounce. So we'll just make sure that the neckline is super neat and tidy, and that's how that looks. And underneath the flounce you can just see that one line of stitching. And that is this little top complete. So I have my both flounces around the neckline, nicely cleaned on the inside with that bias finish. My armholes, same finish, nice and clean. My darts in place in the front. That beautiful rolled hem at the bottom. My back neckline, same thing again here, nice and clean. I've added a hook and eye just for closure. I've got that lovely line of stitches along the centre back seam, and again that gorgeous rolled hem. And this is how it looks on. So in this silk fabric it looks nice and dressed up, maybe out for dinner or out for drinks with the girls. Perfect little top for that. But I've also made this top up in a viscose fabric, which has that same beautiful drape but makes it a much more casual top, which I love. Love the details on this one, the fit, that flounce at the neck, gorgeous.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do. And I shall see you guys on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!